I will introduce Joel, though. Joel Turco, Chief Operating Officer of Wyloo. Joel, I'm going to go quickly through your bio. Joel is Chief Development Officer, should I say, at Wyloo, overseeing strategic investments and acquisitions across Australia and Canada's mining sectors. He's been busy in the last few years because since joining in 2021, he's led the major acquisitions of Mincor, of Neuron Resources in Canada, and obviously now they're in the midst of finalising a joint venture with Hastings and Neo Performance Metals, as we discussed. Joel brings experience from his time with Macquarie Capital's Natural Resources team. He holds a degree in Engineering Commerce and an MBA from the University of WA. He's passionate about advancing the critical mineral supply chain through sustainable and innovative investment, which makes him a perfect participant in this panel. And now, all our fantastic delegates have already stolen most of my questions in this session in the last couple of comments there, so I'm going to have to quickly readjust. But Joel, I might start with you. It strikes me in this conversation that we've been having in Australia about the downstream sector, in the battery space and battery supply chains, that it's become almost binary. Should we go all the way downstream, or should we just stay as a raw materials producer? Should the conversation be a little bit more nuanced than that?
Oh, absolutely. You must have stolen my talking notes, because I was chatting with Graham about this outside earlier. I think we do, when we do talk about downstream processing, that the conversation does devolve into should we or shouldn't we, and it is much more nuanced than that. And I think it does depend on what supply chain you're talking about, what commodity, what end product, what end market. Graham and I were chatting outside about the differences even between battery types. If you think of Australia with our great mineral endowment as primarily being an exporting economy at the moment, it makes sense for us to export the most value-dense product possible, the most value per cubic metre per kilogram. So whenever we are looking at, does it make sense to go further downstream? Well, does the additional value we're going to receive for this outweigh the cost to produce it and then ship and get it to market? And are there various limitations around that product spoiling, et cetera, et cetera? If I look at that through the, using nickel as an example, a nickel cathode electric vehicle battery, does it make sense to produce an electric vehicle battery in Australia? I would contend that no, it does not, because the end market is not here, and you have to send that battery a long way to its final destination, and the economics are eroded. But someone was talking about PCAM earlier, or CAM earlier. PCAM and its ability to travel, does that then become more attractive? I would contend that yes, it does. And then the conversation then, this is a topic close to my heart, is one of how do you produce PCAM at a globally cost competitive level? Things like cost of capital, availability of labour, and technological know-how, and cost of energy, etc., come into play. But the ultimate thing is, no, I don't think we should make electric vehicle batteries here. But from listening to Graham's presentation, that's completely different for a vanadium flow battery. Batteries ain't batteries. And it's different again for rare earths and rare earth magnets. And how far along the supply chain do you go? And it was actually great to see Namali's presentation, because I have this amorphous idea of what those drivers of competitive advantage are. It was nice to see them listed on a slide that someone else made, so I'm going to pinch that. I think that at each point, you're asking yourself the question, does it make sense to move further downstream here? And it becomes a question of, do we have the drivers of competitive advantage to go from this product to the next one? And those aren't static. All of the great work that Warren and Namali are doing is to help build those competitive advantages where they don't already exist. So a long answer to absolutely, it's far more nuanced than just a binary yes/no.
Warren, in your work, I mean, it came at a time, I'm particularly talking around the production tax credit scheme, and the idea of juniors being able to make that leap into the downstream sector. It felt sometimes as though, I'm not saying your members in particular, but companies were looking at downstream as a saviour for their upstream projects. In your work and assessments, what did you find that was I think I know the answer, but what did you find was the result of that sort of a pursuit of creating greater economics for an upstream project?
Yeah, well, look, anyone looking at value adding of a critical mineral as a saviour for their mining project is not going to go particularly well, particularly because it's a much, much harder exercise to get into the value adding game. I think what we've really learned about it is the challenges. We sort of identified the challenges in Namali's presentation, but the reality, the one that really slowed us down and one that is such a problem for us is a lack of the technical expertise and access to the IP. It's one of the reasons it makes vanadium such a great opportunity for us, because it's available. We have access to it. Where the lithium hydroxide piece, we were reliant on our customer coming here, wanting to partner and build a facility here in Western Australia. So for us, what we learned about it was, the first thing we learned about it was it pretty much happens exactly the way it's always happened, which is we're here trying to produce a mine. The company that we're going to sell our raw material to is our customer, is also the value-adding company. In order for them for us to build our mine, we need an off-take agreement with them, which means they're underwriting our project. And ultimately, we haven't got a lot of leveraging to force them to come and build a value-adding facility here in Western Australia, particularly if it's more expensive. So what happened over and over again with companies with real ambitions to do it here in Australia is ultimately they got an off-take agreement in part. The customer built the value-adding facility overseas. We got the mine up. That's a great outcome, but we missed the opportunity. We've got to find ways of getting that here into Australia. So that story for us changed from we believe we can do this, we want to do this, to realising that if we was going to do this, we were going to need support from Australian government and state governments to help realise that ambition. And we're going to need a lot more than just the ambition. We're going to need a plan. We're going to need serious policies and programs behind it to help us succeed. I think we've seen moderate success in some of those spaces. We've seen real challenges in the spaces we attempted it. But I think we've got more realistic about ambitions. I also think we've got clear that where we want to be probably is in the upstream and the midstream space. With the exception of vanadium, I think the reality of us building a lithium-ion battery was never very realistic. There's a lot of people selling that idea, coming to Australia and talking about setting up gigafactories. For us, the values of the upstream and midstream space, that's a good space for us to try to get into. If we do that, we'll be doing very well.
Thanks, Warren. Graham, I'm starting to wonder whether you should even be on this panel, because we're talking about how we make that leap to the downstream and value-added products, despite all the difficulties of geography, market, dislocation, technical skills. I've just listened to your presentation. You've got a defined local market, you've got the technical flow sheet, it's quite simple, and we've got all the skills here. I mean, you've answered it. You've cracked the downstream situation, haven't you? Is this something that could be applied outside of the vanadium sector, do you think?
Could be a what?
Could be applied, your model, could it be applied? Could we see this emerging in other commodities?
Look, I think it's, to Warren's point as well, the answer is yes, it can be applied, and fundamentally how we ended up on this journey is not seeing downstream as the savior of the business, right? Ultimately, I think our business is incredibly much stronger and going to create way more value because of that. But the reason we ended up on this path is by simply looking at the entire supply chain, as all these commodities should do, through the lens of a potential upstream producer, and understanding fundamentally what the drivers are, right? And like, to put it in simple terms with vanadium, it's actually a really interesting case study for others to look at, because a vanadium flow battery, as opposed to like a lithium battery, 50% of the value of a typical utility scale battery is the vanadium, right? So you're actually looking at a complete end market, which is in dollars per megawatt hour, driven by the commodity. And for us, like, the current price of vanadium is $5. We've modeled $10, which is the long-term average, in our energy modeling, right? And that makes flow batteries competitive with lithium, interestingly, right? So when you make that conclusion and you go even at twice the current spot price, which is just the long-term average and a reasonable spot on the cost curve, that makes our upstream business have very nice margins. It gives our midstream the strategic advantage it needs to feed the downstream, and then you're delivering competitive, cost-competitive batteries into the long-duration storage space. So that is a very specific supply chain story for us, and it's easier to understand in that there's only 3 steps. There's make vanadium oxide, make electrolyte, make batteries, and the batteries are just literally tanks filled with electrolyte and pumps. so you can connect the dots. But every metal, to the extent they can, if they have a version of that, it should actually tell you where to do it. And then, upstream, competitive advantage because high grade, long mine life. You have all the makings you need in Australia simply by our endowment. Midstream, that's that story where if you make electrolyte in China, you're shipping millions of liters, you're paying VAT, you're shipping millions of liters, and there's actually a cost advantage to making it here. And then on the downstream side, if you can deliver batteries cost effectively, that's the answer. So that's how we arrived at it, and I hope others can learn from it. And I think you can apply the principles. Every commodity is different, but I think we should learn from vanadium.
Namali, in your assessment across a range of commodities, does vanadium stand out as an example? I mean, it can't be replicated across every commodity and every supply chain, but it stand out as an example of the different drivers and factors that are needed to create an opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is goes back to the point I was making. We've got these 31 critical minerals, and we can't necessarily apply the same levers and policy instruments to all of them, or incentives necessarily, because it is such a different situation for some of them versus others, and volumes as well, volumes and all of those factors that I listed out. So yeah, it could be very much so.
Namali, I want to ask you, stay with you, because we were talking this morning on the discussion about Europe. The issue of Northvolt was brought up. A group that tried to go across the supply chain from upstream all the way down to final end product, and has collapsed in the process. And I think it's seen a shift in European thinking from domestic, local supply chains of European-only investment, European-only skills, infrastructure, etc. We're starting to see a lot of Japanese, Korean, and particularly Chinese investment in that European supply chain. I mean, is it a fallacy to think that we can go it alone without Chinese influence, even if we are trying to diversify these supply chains?
Wow. I mean, we just physically can't go it alone right now. And a lot of our product goes into China. And yes, the investment comes from China, not just here, but around the world, as you're rightly saying. And also the OEMs in those Northern Hemisphere and Asian countries are still sourcing from Chinese midstream. So it's going to take some time, and also some creative thinking between like-minded countries as to how do we practically create an alternative supply pathway. It's not worked up to now. We've talked about a lot, but it's not worked. So there's got to be some levers. And ironically, the state of affairs now may be the push that will force some of these countries to think, okay, we're in dire straits. We've got to actually, intervene in these markets collectively, globally.
I think we are at an inflection point, aren't we, Joel? And I mentioned this morning a comment by UK Minister Ed Miliband at the International Energy Agency's Energy Security Summit in London last week, that it's become about more than, the idea of critical minerals has become about more than purely decarbonisation. It's about energy security for many of these countries now. Are you seeing that reflected in the movements of governments and policy changes, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that this is a really interesting time, maybe we live in interesting times. We're in them right now. And I think it's academically fascinating, albeit it might hurt a bit at times as well. But we are, for the first time in, a decade really or more, we're seeing those risks that were typically kind of afterthoughts in a risk register somewhere in your presentation truly manifest. We're actually seeing the restriction on exports of not just one or two obscure things, like a multitude of critical minerals, and it is forcing the the idea of critical minerals as critical to national security, critical to energy security, those risks have become manifest. And, I think that's why we're seeing these huge swings in company valuations when they suddenly become extraordinarily critical to certain supply chains. We saw, you mentioned earlier, we're a shareholder in a company called Neo Performance Materials, which is most notably the largest commercial producer of magnets outside of China, of finished magnets, but also a producer of many rare metals, one of which is gallium. And when China put export restrictions on gallium at the end of last year, you actually did get, there was a period of time where people would use like green premium or a sustainability premium or a critical mineral premium as a punchline. There was a 70% divergence between gallium supply inside of China and outside of China. So, that Neo had this great period of outperformance at the end of last year as a result of its gallium supply. And I think if something similar happens with the light rare earths, we'll see something similar. So we really are seeing, the idea of critical minerals as being, sure, it was a great story when it spoke to decarbonisation, but what really mobilises politicians? National security, energy security.
Warren, is this what's mobilising the incumbent government's new policy initiative of a critical mineral stockpile? Is this something that will disappear even if re-elected come Sunday, or do you think this is something that the government is taking seriously now here in Australia? Security of.
Look, I think they're taking it seriously. I think what's happening for Australia is we're getting stuck in this problem between the United States and China, and this effort to sort of force a divergence between the supply chain. And that's been driven by the things that Joel says, energy security, national interest, fear of vulnerability in their own supply chains. So, but the worst scenario for us is we just get pushed from being a raw material supplier to China to being a raw material supplier for the United States. At least in theory, this should be an opportunity for us to leverage new investment, to help us go downstream, to realise more value and actually benefit from the competition taking place between these two countries. But that's not what's happening. What's happening is a huge amount of political pressure in all sorts of very sensitive areas like Australia's and the region's national defence and its reliance on the United States for our strategic defence being pulled into commercial and other elements. So for us, what's happening is government's trying very hard to walk this pathway between the two without upsetting our national strategic defence partner, but also not closing off opportunities from China. I think from our point of view, what have we got to, the reality is whether or not we continue to value add or not is an issue for the downstream of the value chain. The reality is we don't manufacture a huge number of things in Australia. Our own industry security isn't at risk from whether or not something's cut off from China or the United States. For us, it's about what's our play here and how do we advantage ourselves. That's what I think the government's starting to think about, and it's really responding to the United States' needs is a way Australia's starting to think about, okay, well, how do we improve our position? So I think they're serious about it, but that said, they're going to have to get much more serious about increasing the scale of our ambition, because $1.2 billion in a strategic reserve, although could be quite important for some of those niche critical minerals, isn't a lot in the scheme of what's going on. We're going to have to play a much bigger hand if we're going to make a real difference in terms of our own resilience and indeed actually leveraging our strengths.
Namali, is the announcement, the policy announcement last week made you reassess Australia's role in this global supply chain?
No. No, but I think I said to someone earlier today, this is, the devil will be in the detail, obviously, of what that looks like, of what a reserve would look like. But the great thing about it is that the government is willing to intervene in the market where there is a market failure. So this is a good thing. But we have to be really careful about stockpiles in terms of where they tend to work in countries where there is a monopoly or there is a big downstream. So where is our stockpile going to go and how we're going to price it, and there's lots and lots of things to think about. But, the main point is it is a step into the market, like from government, to really support the industry.
Thanks, Namali. I can't get the vision out of my head of our critical mineral stockpile looking like soils ain't soils with different piles. What would you like today? Nickel concentrate. There you go. Do you want some rare earth? There it is over there. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, as we have done all day today. Every one of these conversations probably could take a session in itself. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us.